Morning, everybody. My name is Mark Harrison. I'm Head of UK Applied Science at the Met Office, and it's my privilege to welcome you this morning to this briefing regarding the CCRA4 technical report. As the name suggests, this is a fourth iteration of the independent assessment into the risks and opportunities that climate change presents the UK. Okay, next slide, Alison. Thank you. Okay, before we start, I should say that the session is being recorded and will be uploaded for others who are not able to join us today to watch back in slower time. We think that there's a privileged day or local holiday that may impact some people in Northern Ireland, so we'll be looking to catch up with this cohort in the coming weeks. So over the next hour or so, we aim to share some details regarding our plans and then answer any questions that you might have. We're allowing a fair amount of time for this Q&A session, so please post your questions using the Q&A function on Teams. I'm joined this morning by three other speakers, so if I could ask Flo, Jason and Rachel to unmute, please, and introduce themselves. Flo.
I assume you wanted us in that order, Mark. So I will go first. My name is Flo Bates. I'm at the Climate Change Committee, and I'm the head of the Independent Assessment, which is being taken place as part of the fourth Climate Change Risk Assessment. I'll hand over to, I think, Rachel.
Brilliant. Thanks, Flo. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Perks, and I sit within the Met Office, also working with Mark within UK Applied Science. So over to Jason.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm Jason Lowe. I work within the Met Office as Head of Climate Services for Government, and with Mark, I'm leading the technical report for CCRA4.
Thank you. So in terms of an agenda, in just a minute, I'll hand over to Flo, who'll be setting the scene for the technical report and putting this in the context of other work that is ongoing. Then Flo will hand over to Jason, who will talk through our approach to the delivery of this work. And then I'll share a few more details regarding the consortium, with Rachel finishing off by explaining ways in which you yourselves can get involved. We'll then hold the question and answer session. If you don't get round to all the questions today, we'll publish them online subsequently. We've also joined by Richard Miller from the CCEC, who'll be helping to answer any questions towards the end, as well as Katie Peat from DEFRA. So without any more delay, I'll hand over to Flo.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Mark. If we can go to our first slide, please. So for those who don't know, the Climate Change Committee was established through the Climate Change Act of 2008. We provide independent advice to government, both on meeting our long-term greenhouse gas emission targets, but also on providing advice around the risks and opportunities the UK faces from climate change. And we provide regular progress updates to Parliament, both on progress on reducing emissions and progress on adapting to climate change. This slide here is intended to set out what the UK adaptation policy cycle is. So as you can see in the top left-hand corner of the slide is what we're talking about today. So we've been commissioned by both the UK government and the devolved administrations to provide an independent assessment of the risks and opportunities the UK faces. We're calling this CCRA4-IA, which is maybe not the snappiest of titles, but that's what we've been commissioned to do and which we're working with the Met Office to deliver. Alongside this, we'll provide our independent statutory advice. And together, these two different products that we produce will form the UK Government Climate Change Risk Assessment, which will be presented to Parliament in 2027. This UK Government Climate Change Risk Assessment underpins the national adaptation plans, both for the UK and the devolved administrations, with the next one expected in 2028. All of this work is underpinned by the incredibly high quality evidence base, which is listed on the right-hand side, including both our climate projections, the academic and grey literature evidence base, as well as the risk assessments and the adaptation plans produced both by the private sector, for example, through the adaptation reporting power, and in other kind of sectors and administrations. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, this is the independent assessment for the fourth climate change risk assessment. And we have 4 key objectives that we're trying to achieve in this. So first of all, this is the fourth one. We're lucky enough to be able to build on previous assessments to ensure continuity, to ensure backwards looking comparability, and to create a process which is sustainable going forward. The insight that we're looking to provide to government needs to be authoritative, evidence-based and up-to-date to enable the most robust adaptation policy making. We want to enable and support adaptation action. This isn't just about highlighting the risks, but we want to set out which are the most effective near-term adaptation actions and build the case for that both within and beyond government. And finally, we want to ensure that what we produce is useful to and usable by decision makers. So accessibility and usability are key priorities for this risk assessment. We can move on to the next slide. So we'll be producing 3 key outputs as part of the 4th Climate Change Risk Assessment. So the first of all is the technical report, which we'll be talking about today. Through this, the consortium, which is being led by the Met Office, is reviewing the published evidence to identify the climate risks and opportunities that the UK faces. And for each of those risks, they'll be assessing the urgency of additional action. Secondly, we'll be producing the Well Adapted UK report. This is a new product which you won't be familiar with, but through this, we're hoping to deliver very innovative analysis, which sets out what good adaptation looks like for a subset of key risks. For those adaptation actions, we'll be setting out the costs and benefits using robust economic approaches. And we'll be setting out short and long-term targets to produce, to really set the direction for policymaking and to enable progress over a longer time period. Alongside our independent assessment, we'll also be providing the statutory advice report. Through this, our committee will be providing independent advice, which recommends policy actions needed for the next set of adaptation plans. We'll also be highlighting near-term opportunities for adaptation in the policy cycle before 2028. But the kind of key point of the slide is just to highlight how the technical report, which is what we're speaking about today, is really critical for underpinning both the Well Adapted UK report and our advice report. And we know that through talking with stakeholders, it's really critical for mobilising the responses by both the UK government and devolved administrations, as well as actions by other stakeholders in this space. So if we can move on to my final slide. So what are we trying to do? So as mentioned before, this is a synthesis of the evidence base, providing the most up-to-date perspective on the risks and opportunities which the UK faces from climate change. There are kind of 3 key elements of our approach, which I know Jason's going to pick up on in the next kind of set of slides. But first of all, as I mentioned before, this is an update rather than a complete throwing the CCRA3 out the window and starting again. What we really would like is backwards looking comparability. So this will be up to date, but it will be able to be compared with the previous version of this report. We're hoping to refine the urgency scoring framework. This is going to enable clearer identification at the national level about what the key risks are for each nation. And then finally, we're hoping that this report is accessible and that it's understandable and that it's usable. And in order to achieve those objectives, we're taking a key approach of co-development, which is part of what this webinar is trying to achieve. So just to say before I hand over to Jason, that we're really excited that the expertise, the UK Met Office and a incredibly intelligent bunch of academics are delivering on this technical report, and that we look forward to seeing it in late 2025. Thank you very much.
Okay, could we have the next slide? Thank you. So I wanted to give a perspective of what this project contains from the consortium. We'll hear later who's in our consortium. We're very proud of the broad range of expertise we've managed to assemble, and Mark will be talking about that. And as Flo highlighted, co-development is really important, and Rachel will be talking about more ways to get involved as we move through the timeline. So just to reflect back, what is the overall exam question that we're trying to address with the technical report? So we want to understand how the evidence on the full range of risks that face the UK from climate change and their urgency have continued to evolve over the last 5 years. Now, what that means is we'll focus on the change since CCRA3. There's a lot of additional literature. There's also a lot of additional lived experience. We want to work closely with stakeholders, and part of that will be thinking about a manageable list of the risks. And we also want to work with the adaptation committee to think about the scoring of the risks and consider whether an additional urgency category would be helpful, both for action and for research. Next slide, please. Oh, we've gone past the slide. Can we go back, please? So that means we'll focus on what's changed and what's most urgent. We'll co-develop with stakeholders, but we also want to make sure we've got resilience within the consortium. Now, that will include having joint chapter leads, making use of existing structures like the Met Office Academic Partnership and existing relationships and networks. So they're already in place. We also want to bring in a diversity of ideas, and one of the items that Mark will showcase is the concept of a fresh eyes perspective on the CCRA, but we balance that with also having continuity authors from previous risk assessments. We also focus very much on quality and confidence in the results. So within the consortium, I lead a science assurance panel, but we're in the process of also assembling an external independent panel to provide friendly but critical advice. And there'll be various stages where we can gather community information, including a community review of an interim version of the report. Next slide, please. So we've now been running this project since around May. And one of the first tasks, it's been led by Susie Lawrence of the University of Leeds. It's looked at how people have used CCRA3, especially the technical report. And I wanted to show some of the findings. The approach has been a mix of desk work, looking at publications that refer to CCRA3, and also interviews and focus groups. So what does it find? It finds that risks are not always sufficiently well targeted at those responsible for policy. And so that mapping between risks and the people who can lead on doing something about it is one of the areas we're keen to build on in this CCRA. Some of the additional suggestions that came out of this study was to think about the number of risks, and something that came up from several stakeholders was that at the moment the risks are a mix of buckets and thimbles, i.e. some of the risks actually contain a very large number of component risks, whereas others are very, very specific. We need to strike a balance. There's also a suggestion to focus more on the interdependence of the challenges. And again, think about how we link those to the ownership of interdependent risks. There's an interest in thinking about the nature and the impact of sudden shocks, and a request for perhaps a more graphical mapping of going from hazards through risks to impacts and then linking to the risk owners. And there's also a desire to strengthen the economic analysis of the impacts. And that's something Flo mentioned when thinking about the well-adapted UK report as well. Next slide, please. So if we go a little bit deeper, this diagram on the right-hand side is one I suspect most of the audience will recognise. It shows the 61 risks from CCRA3. And you'll recall that 34 of the 61 were ranked in that more action needed. And that's actually quite difficult to make use of. It's like setting an exam and everybody getting the same grade. It doesn't help with prioritising the action we need around acting on climate change. So this time around, we want to make sure we can arrive at a relevant set of risks that can be more clearly prioritised. And that will include a proposal to increase the granularity of the more action needed score. And to really start to understand how we do that, we've been looking at other risk assessments internationally, in particular, the European Climate Change Risk Assessment and the New Zealand Climate Change Risk Assessment, trying to gather lessons from those to inform our update of the method. Next slide, please. One other area where there's a change from CCRA3 is in the method for thinking about climate scenarios. And this is something we find people ask about very frequently. There's a very good method document that the CCC have put together. But essentially, the method is thinking about a range of emission scenarios that are broadly consistent with global emission pledges. And you can see an illustration of this on the right-hand side with several individual future scenarios illustrated. So taking this, we could say which levels should we be focusing on for looking at the climate risks? And that's contained in a table on the right-hand side. So we'll look at the central case of local climate change for a global warming level of 1.5 in the 2030s and 2 degrees in the 2050s. But we also want to consider the high climate hazard case, where the global warming level goes up to 2 in the 2030s and to 2.5 in the 2050s. And then when we look locally in that case, we'll be looking at the more extreme end of the range from the climate data. In the State of the Climate chapter, there'll also be a need to consider and comment on climate beyond 2050 and higher impact, low likelihood events and scenarios. Next slide, please. So I wanted to really show before finishing the steps that we'll go through within the project. And I've put a timeline along the bottom to illustrate roughly where we are. So task 1 was very much the idea of setting up and working at how we're going to deploy co-development within the project. And task 2, you've just seen the results of some of that. That's going out and understanding how CCRA3 was used. That study is currently now in draft form and is in review. The authors are responding to review comments. The other area where there's been a lot of discussion so far is on the method development and thinking about the list of risks and the urgency framing. That work is ongoing. It will lead into task 5, which takes place starting in the summer, so that'll be starting soon, which is an initial view of the risk list and starting to think about how the evidence has evolved. That will lead into a deep dive of these risks in the autumn, task 6. And then with task 7 and 8, we'll be developing and putting out for review an interim version of the assessment. We'll be finalising the assessment during the late summer of next year with task 9. And so the aim is to publish the technical report at that point. We also have, you'll see along the bottom, task 4, one of the ways of collecting evidence, and I would encourage everybody to really feed in your thoughts to this process. But we have an open call open, asking you seen what you've experienced and what you've contributed to the literature that we should be considering. At that point, I'm going to hand over to Mark to talk about our consortium.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, so in order to deliver this work, it's clear that we require input from people with a wide range of skills and expertise. So we started off by reaching out to our academic partner universities before then bringing in additional skills and expertise from across our National Climate Science Partnership. Since then, we've also been approached by a range of other organisations wanting to get involved. So we've welcomed a number of these additional organisations to help contribute to this work. And so it's great to have representation from across public, private sector, as well as from the third sector. Next slide, please, Alison. So you might see the ... at the bottom right of this screen. I think that's in recognition of the fact that if you'd like to get involved, then please reach out either by contacting myself or by contacting the generic email address that's up on the screen there. Next slide, please. So in terms of the way in which this report will be structured, the aspiration is to have State of the Climate chapter followed by 5 other main chapters, that being economy, health and well-being, built environment, infrastructure, and land, nature and food. So as Jason mentioned earlier, we have lead authors who are accountable for the delivery of their respective chapters and will act as primary points of contact for each of the chapters. The primary purpose of having joint authorship is to build in a degree of resilience. Next slide. So they'll be supported by continuity authors. Clearly, continuity between iterations of the CCRA is really important. So that's their primary purpose. As the name suggests, these are people who have been involved with previous iterations of the CCRA process. We've also introduced this concept of fresh eyes, of which Rachel, one of our speakers, is one. These are early career researchers who have been asked to challenge our thinking as we develop this work. So it's great to have them on board. The intention is that the Fresh Eyes cohort will also benefit from this experience as a whole and will be well placed to take on leadership roles in future assessments in the years to come. Then we have the methods team, the two Davids, who are very much coordinating our approach and trying to ensure consistency between the chapters, as well as the science assurance team, whose job it is to ensure the quality of the work and the outputs themselves. We have one team that's part of the consortium, as well as an independent review group that we're commissioning at the moment. Finally, we've got the rest of the team, which includes myself and the knowledge integration and comms team, who are creating a plan for engagement, as well as a small team that's been looking at the ways in which CCRA3 was used to inform our own plans. Okay, so over to you, Rachel, for the final bit.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. So I think it's important now to just reach out to all of you and sort of tell you how you can get engaged in the process that we have here. So this tailors back to some of the things that Jason's already mentioned. We have our open pool for evidence, and I've borrowed this diagram because I think it's a really useful way to explain the different steps that we have. And I'll go into a few of these in a bit more detail on the coming slides. But in addition to that, we are co-producing, as Flo has said, between ourselves and our government colleagues. And we've got some workshops that we are soon to be starting that are going to be looking at the risks from CCRA3 and what these might look like in CCRA4. Then beyond that, each of the chapters are going to be looking at all of this in a lot more detail and going into sort of more of a deep dive on what the risks will look like specific to their sort of chapters. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on the coming slides about that too. And then finally, as also has been mentioned, we're also going to have our interim version of our report open for the community to look into. So Alison, if I have the next slide, please. The first thing for us to consider here is the open pool for evidence. So I've added the link there to the slide, but I've also just checked before this meeting that's very easy to Google, and it can be found both on the Met Office website and the Committee for Climate Change website. This is open now and is open until September 2024. And as most people on the call will be aware, this is a really good place for you to put forward all of your academic papers that feed into this type of assessment. But beyond that, we're also looking for project reports that you might have written for government colleagues that ultimately feed into policy briefs, and other grey literature such as conference proceedings or webinars, or even your PhD thesis. Beyond this, we're going to have a further 2 calls for evidence, and these are going to be much more targeted into the evidence gaps. So filling in those bits of information that we've not covered in the first call for evidence. Next slide, please. And then I've pulled together a bit of an example from one of the chapters that we've been working with, and we're still co-producing this framework with the other chapter leads as well. And this is looking at that deep dive that I've mentioned before. So chapter leads have already started to engage with the technical and academic partners for each of their fields of expertise. And then late summer, we're looking to pull together a series of technical surveys to get information from everybody on the things that we need to consider for the CCRA4 Independent Assessment. Then going through into the autumn, we're looking to hold a further set of workshops that sort of go into a lot more detail and then can pull out some of the cross-cutting themes that go beyond the chapter and sort of linking between what everybody's been working on. And then by April 2025, we'll look to have this interim report that will go out for community review. So all of these areas, starting with these technical surveys through to the workshops and the review of the final report, are all areas where we're looking for people to engage. And I will leave that there and hand back to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so said we leave a fair amount of time for questions, and we have allowed up to half an hour for questions. So I can see that there are 150 or more people on the call. So it'd be great if you could take a moment to reflect on what you've just heard and add your questions to the Q&A. In the meantime, I can see that there are a couple that have been asked, so I'll just respond to those that I can do, and then open them up to the other panel members. So yes, I think Jenny, you asked about IOAF. Apologies for the acronym. I just put a link by means of a response back in the chat. So that is the Infrastructure Operators Adaptation Forum, and I can see there that Emma, who's a lead on the infrastructure chapter, is also added to that as well. Essentially, we're trying to engage with many existing fora as possible, so that is one entity with which we're seeking to engage. So thank you for that, Jenny. Chris, thank you for posting your question. I think you're on the train at the moment, so thank you for taking the time to dial in. Yes, we're aware of the bank holidays when scheduling this session, but I think privilege days are a bit more tricky to identify. So that is part of the reason for recording this session, and then we'll have a follow-up session with people from Northern Ireland, and we'll reach out to, well, we have actually reached out to people in Scotland as well who are unable to make this session today. So thanks for reiterating that. Next one, what are the main evidence gaps and risks? Jason, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to some extent, that's what each of the chapters will be looking at. They'll be looking at what are the main evidence gaps around the risks. So when we think of the situation in the UK, there is a lack of evidence of progress. I mean, we've seen that from the work that the CCC has published, but there are also some examples of good practice in adaptation. And I think understanding both of those is actually really quite useful to do. Specifically here, where we're assessing the risks rather than adaptation, we'll be looking at where there is new information about how the risks manifest in each of the 5 systems that Mark presented. We'll be looking to see, for instance, how complex risk is arising. So we won't just be looking at direct risks. We'll be thinking about the role of compound, cascading and aggregated risks. We'll also be thinking about the risks across a range of scenarios, including thinking about whether there are surprises, and thinking about the present day level of resilience as we progress into the future. And we'll be hoping to draw both on the academic literature, but also on the contributions that people are able to show, for instance, from internal organisation reports and from processes like the ARP.
Thank you, Jason. Next one, Flo, would you be able to answer this? I see that the business and industry chapter that was in previous CCRAs is no longer there. What is the reason behind this? Is it, how is this being incorporated across other chapters? Are you able to pick that one up?
Yeah, of course. So what you'll see instead of the business and industry chapter is that we've broadened that out to include the economy. And part of the reason behind that is we felt that there were certain sectors which were being possibly overlooked through calling it business and industry, but all of the kind of risks that we were considering within the business and industry chapter, we are looking to continue to look at within the 4th climate change risk assessment. But on top of that, considering things such as the financial sector slightly more explicitly than we were previously.
Thanks. And there's a follow-on actually about international risk. Would you be able to cover that off at the same time, Flo?
Yeah, sorry, what's the question? Is that
How international dimensions will be covered off?
yeah. So within the technical report, we're considering a lot of international risks within the assessment of the individual risks. So, for example, when we're considering risk to the energy sector, as well as considering the domestic risks to the domestic UK energy sector, we'll also be considering, how do risks, say, in France or Norway, propagate throughout the UK via the interconnectors. There are some risks which are entirely transboundary and don't fit within our sector mapping. So I think there's, I can't quite remember them, but there's a sort of conflict-related risk, overseas conflict-related risk, which maybe doesn't naturally fit within the key sectors that we're looking at. And there's a bit of a discussion about exactly where to evaluate those risks, but you will see them reflected in the report.
Thank you, Flo. One for you, Rachel. Given the important role of metro mayors or combined authorities with an increasing shift of devolved powers in England, how will this group be engaged?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I mentioned early on that we're engaging with our colleagues across government that are responsible for the risks at the minute and running a series of workshops with them over the summer. Beyond those colleagues, we are looking to engage with all of the devolved administrations as well. So we've invited them along to the workshops. And in addition to that, Mark mentioned that there are some people that aren't able to make it here today because of various public holidays in Northern Ireland. And I've noticed in the chat as well, parts of Scotland. So we've reached out to them as well to see if there is like an additional follow-on that we can have with those. If there are any specific contacts, obviously, then please do reach out through the generic email and let us know, because we can share this information with chapter leads and then they can be included within those sort of deeper dive topics as well. So there's a variety of different ways that we can be engaging with those groups.
Can I just add to that very briefly? So I think very related is also how we work with local authorities, and there's a question from Michael on that topic. That's an area where, of course, there are existing networks that we're able to plug into, including drawing on the fact that Met Office has been engaging with local authorities to try to understand their climate information needs around resilience. So those existing networks do bring in that layer of local authorities, and I would agree there's a lot of information about resilience from what is happening across the country.
Thank you, Jason. A couple of questions regarding the calls for evidence. One from Johnny regarding whether or not it's acceptable to incorporate lived experiences. So I think I'll cover these two off if that's okay. So I think in Rachel's slide, she mentioned the call for evidence, particularly highlighting the aspiration to cover off the grey literature. So I think we are very interested in receiving all sorts of information, I think, from people. So I think we do need to kind of ensure quality in some way, shape or form. That's obviously easiest done if it's in the published literature that's had some sort of built-in quality assurance, but this is something that the chapter leads will be considering as they start to review the information that comes in through the call for evidence. I think there was a second one regarding the call for evidence in terms of the timeframes. Essentially, there is a call for evidence out currently, and it's going to remain open during the summer. And there will be another couple, with the next one being in the autumn, and that's potentially going to be a little bit more targeted and focused. So there will be multiple opportunities in future and to contribute evidence, and we'll be advertising those in due course. So I think, Jason, you talked about the local authorities engagement here.
Yeah, I picked up Michael's comment as we went through in particular.
Thank you. Jason, do you want to say anything about opportunities as well as risks? Whether or not they'll be recognised? I think Keith Jones made that comment.
Yeah, so this was something actually we've been debating. There are a number of opportunities on the list at present. There's still a debate, I think, to be had on how we handle the opportunities. So yes, we're thinking about it, and when we finalise the methodology, that will have clarity on the treatment of opportunities. But we haven't made a final decision on that yet.
Thank you. I can see there's a few comments regarding marine issues. I'm not sure whether or not anybody on the panel wants to pick that up. We do have 3 chapter leads on that particular chapter. So I think they'll probably the best approach to that is for them to reach out to you directly in terms of thinking about how we address some of these questions that you raise. That might be one that we pick up subsequently in an FAQ.
Mark, if we can say though around the marine issues, so we do acknowledge there's a need to improve in this area. There was mention of that in particular when we looked at how CCRA3 was being used. It was one of the issues that came up. We also recognise that there are some existing networks that can provide very useful input, including MSIP as one of those, and we'll make sure that we will reach out to that network. We would also encourage marine contributions to the call for evidence as well.
Thank you, Jason. Flo, there's one here from Kate Scott. Is a focus on adaptation or resilience, and how do you see them being distinct from each other?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll actually hand over to my colleague Richard for that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Flo, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we are keen, I think, as both Flo and Jason have talked to, is to use the language that is used in government on this. So I think where that ends up at the end of this process, we'll have to see. I think at the moment there's perhaps a sense that resilience is getting a bit more of a traction and is a bit more comprehensible across the policy space, whereas adaptation is obviously has a lot of history too. So I think the principle we want to take is to use the language that will help it cut through with the key policy audiences. I'd maybe just also add quickly to what Flo said at the start is that, you know, as well as the technical report this time, we'll also be doing this new well-adapted UK report led from the CCC that will look in a lot more depth about action that is needed to drive adaptation and improve resilience for some of the key areas. So I think however we end up which language we end up focusing on through the final products, I think what you can be assured of is that we want to bring forward a lot more action orientated evidence and information as part of the overall CCRA package this time to hopefully drive the policy response forward to take those next steps from just considering climate change in planning to actually driving delivery on the ground.
And there is, of course, a link between resilience and adaptation through the urgency scoring framework. So just to reassure them that they're not independent.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jason. Are there any final questions? There seems to be a slight lag, I think, on some of the machines in this room, but I can't see any further questions at the moment. So if people do have any final burning questions, please pop them in.
I can see a couple of questions, Mark. Do you want me to read them out?
Please.
So someone called Emma has said, could you provide a bit more detail about public sector engagement, and is there a document that sets out your stakeholder mapping work? Maybe Rachel can answer that.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so we've been working really closely with the chapter leads to date. That was one of the things I had early on in my slide, and that has been to pull together all of the stakeholders that we are aware of within each of the different chapters that we're working on. And then going beyond that, we've been reaching out to colleagues within the Committee on Climate Change and within DEFRA to add into that. So we have a very big document internally now that documents all of the different people that we feel that we need to engage with, all of the different stakeholders. And that goes beyond academia into the private sector and public sector as well. If like later on in the summer, if you don't feel like you've been contacted to engage with anything in specific and wanted to support in any particular way, then I do really encourage everyone to reach out to that generic email address and to contribute to the call for evidence as well.
Great. And Bethany's asked a question about where nature will sit within the Well Adapted UK report. So maybe I can kind of take that. So yes, so within the technical report, nature, there's risks to, I think, agriculture, land use and nature, where we'll be considering risks to different types of habitats. Within the Well Adapted UK report, there are kind of two areas where nature will fit in. So first of all, we do, again, kind of have a kind of sector, which is around agriculture, nature and land use, where we'll be considering the adaptation actions needed within that sector, particularly with a focus around like farmed landscapes. We'll also, throughout the report, be considering the co-benefits of different adaptation actions. And what we do know from the literature is that nature-focused interventions often can support resilience, but also deliver additional co-benefits at the same time. So there may be cases where sort of natural interventions within, say, the urban environment, so improving green space, can help with kind of addressing some of the risks that that can precipitate in those environments, such as extreme heat. Mark, are you back? Can you see the questions again, or should we continue with this?
It's slightly bizarre, Flo. I have a colleague sitting next to me whose laptop is updating faster than mine.
Okay, great.
So
I'll hand back over to you then.
I'm just taking a look through her laptop. So there's a question from Jess regarding the early career researchers. Rachel, is that something you can answer?
I've just replied to you directly in the Q&A there, Jess. Feel free to reach out to me directly. I've added my email in there for you. And that goes to anyone else as well. You can probably find Jess's question in the Q&A and then my response at my email.
Thank you, Rachel. Flo, this might be one for you and or Richard regarding making more structural recommendations to central government. I'm not sure if you're able to see that question, Flo.
Yeah, I can see that. So within the independent assessment, it's our job to provide the evidence base with a kind of quite independent perspective for DEFRA to then translate that into the UK climate change risk assessment and present it in front of Parliament. Within our statutory advice, that's kind of more the space where the committee can provide policy recommendations, and I think potentially consider governance structures as part of that. Richard, I don't know if that's something you'd like to add to.
Yeah, no, not too much, but I think you said it there. Yeah, I think that's exactly the space of the CCC statutory advice. That's the place where the committee can, based on the evidence that this report and the other bits of the independent assessment pulled together, can make recommendations about what should be done off the back of it to hopefully drive adaptation policy further forward in the next set of national adaptation plans from governments around the UK.
Thank you both. There's a question regarding to what extent are the responses to past CCRA3s being considered and driving the methodology. So Jason mentioned earlier that there was a task specifically looking at the way in which CCRA3 has been adopted. and subsequently used, and that has very much fed into some of our thinking regarding the way in which we're approaching the methodology this time round. Conscious that there was a meeting just on Friday that I wasn't actually present at myself. I'm not sure whether or not Jason or Flo, there's anything following that meeting you feel able to share at this point, or would you prefer to leave it at that we're incorporating that within our thinking?
I mean, from my perspective, I think the lessons we're kind of embedding through the discussions of the methodology, but it's not the only route. So as you showed, Mark, when you talked about the consortium, we have continuity authors. And so we also bring those lessons from CCRA3 as to what's worked, what hasn't worked, into the author teams. We also have the lessons learned documents, and I suspect many people on this call probably engaged in that process around lessons learned. And again, that's feeding in to the methods, and in particular this idea of how do we end up with a manageable set of risks that is relevant to how they can be acted upon, and also how do we add more granularity to the scoring. I think there are also some particular lessons, and this was mentioned briefly on Friday, around the presentation of the report so that it's more accessible to the people who need to read it.
Thank you, Jason. You mentioned the scoring framework. There's a question by Clive in there about the way in which the scoring reflects the 4 nations. Are you able to say anything about that?
Flo, do you want to take that first and I can add to it, or do you want me to take it?
Just to say that we will continue to provide a score for each of the 4 nations. Recognizing that that's particularly important for making sure that when each say the Welsh government are developing their national adaptation programme, having a good understanding of which are the priority risks faced locally is really critical. But Jason, I don't know if you want to add to that.
So I agree with all of that. I was just going to add the point that we talked about the communication as well with the devolved, and whether as we develop the text we can reflect what the highest local concerns are in each of the devolved administrations, and give that a little bit more of narrative detail, so that the people using the report in the devolved have clear examples and are able to tell stories and narratives around what's relevant to their stakeholders. And I think that's a really important point about how we communicate.
Thank you. There's a question here regarding timelines or timeframes of interest. Flo, I'm not sure whether or not you'd be able to say a few words to this. So the question is, based on the earlier slides, are the 2080s of less interest, with more emphasis being placed on near-term horizons?
Yeah. So I believe it's the same way in the 3rd climate change risk assessment. We're focusing on the 2030s, the 2050s, and the 2080s. Whether I think the kind of predominant focus is on the shorter term, because we have greater certainty with what's going to come in the 2030s and 2050s, whereas the 2080s is even more dependent than before that on which emissions trajectory we take across the globe. We're also aware that kind of the national adaptation plans happen on a 5-year cycle, and it's important we provide the most robust and up-to-date evidence for actions that need to be taken in the short term, although of course you should kind of take actions in the short term with a view to the longer term as well. So I would say that kind of the 2080s are still very much being considered, but I think it is fair to say that we're possibly more interested in the nearer term impacts that we're expecting.
And we recognise some sectors, for instance, the marine sector, where there are long timescales associated with sea level rise, and also there are large investment decisions and long lifetimes to those aspects of infrastructure.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end of the questions, and there's one regarding the historic environment and how that sits within the report. I think this has been a point that's been raised a few times. Where would you see that going, Flo?
Yeah, so the historic environment we know is very important to people. It sits within our built environment chapter, and there's a risk that is being considered. It is also likely to be picked up in the Well Adapted UK report, and we're very excited for that to have a excellent evidence base in the fact that organisations such as the National Trust are submitting a adaptation reporting power report for the first time.
Thank you, Flo. And there's a comment by Keith flagging the importance of cascading and compound risks. I think that's something that Jason referred to a little earlier, actually. So thank you for that confirmation, Keith.
There's also a comment by Paul also on this topic. And I'm aware of some of the work going on in this sector, including Paul's work in, I believe, in health and also, I think, in prison environments. Please do use the call for evidence, though, as an opportunity to put where you're aware of work onto our radar. Some of it we'll be aware of already, but not all of it. So we'll keep coming back to this idea of please use the call for evidence as much as you're able to do.
Thank you, Jason, for highlighting that once more. I think we've been through vast majority of the questions, if not all of the questions. Are there any questions that I've skimmed over that any of the panel members want to pick up on?
So there was one from Simon that I just want to acknowledge. So he's picked up, we have referenced the academic sector in the presentation, but he's also pointing out the essential need to take into account practitioners. I wanted to acknowledge that. We do have some practitioners in our consortium group, so we have contributions from HR Wallingford, Mott MacDonald and the British Red Cross, but we're also very keen to have practitioners feeding into the call for evidence and also engaging with the chapters as we go through the summer and into the autumn. So I think there's very much a role for practitioners, and I think we'll be making sure that that you have visibility alongside the academic work that we draw on.
Thank you, Jason, for spotting that. Apologies, Simon, I must have scrolled over that one.
Yeah, and just one other question which came from Juliet around kind of considerations about fairness, equality and justice. This is something which we're looking to pick up both within the technical report in the methodology for reviewing the evidence, but also it's a really big focus of our work within the Well Adapted UK report, where we're considering the distributional impacts of different climate risks and the distributional impacts of different adaptation actions as well. So as part of that, we're kind of collecting some work, some data around like spatial data around indicators of vulnerability and using that to identify kind of spatial hotspots within the UK, as well as I say, considering the distributional impacts of risk and adaptation actions.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the participants who have taken time out of their day to contribute and post their questions. Thank you to the panel, including Richard and Katie, who have also been online to answer any particularly tricky questions. So thank you to the pair of you. Please keep up this conversation in terms of either reaching out via the call for evidence, the generic email address, and also speaking to the chapter leads directly. And we look forward to engaging with you in future. So unless there's anything else from any of the panel members, I think we should draw this to a close. Thank you very much.